Welcome to a long-awaited retrospective of the Hannibal TV show, brought to you by the wonderful donators on Patreon. Because let's be honest, this series is for sure gonna get demonetized due to the carnival of blood, gore and murder the show is. So if you enjoy this video, please consider donating to the Patreon so we can keep this series going. And with all that business out of the way, let's begin. Developed by sometimes called visionary, other times called problematic, Bryan Fuller, Hannibal was created as a prequel to Thomas Harris's Red Dragon, but it's also more of a reimagining, taking elements from all of the books, except for Silence of the Lambs due to ownership issues, and expanding on the story and, pardon the pun, fleshing out the characters, specifically the characters of Will Graham and Hannibal Lecter. Will Graham, previously played by William Peterson in Manhunter and Edward Norton in Red Dragon, is now played by Hugh Dancy. And the fact that Hugh Dancy was in the running to play Hannibal in Hannibal Rising makes a great connection. And to me, Hugh Dancy's portrayal feels very much like a combination of the Peterson version and the Norton version, leaning heavily to Peterson's side. On the other side of the coin, the character of Hannibal Lecter, previously played by Brian Cox in Manhunter, Anthony Hopkins in Red Dragon, Silence of the Lambs and Hannibal, and Gaspard Ulliel in Hannibal Rising. I think you can tell which one people remember the most, and pretty big shoes to fill. So this time around, Danish actor Mads Mickelson was chosen. And Mads Mikkelson's performance doesn't really have much of a comparison, but one thing that tells you everything you need to know, Mickelson chose to play the character very much like Lucifer on Earth. We'll get into what that means exactly in episode 1, Aperitif. One last thing before we begin. I do believe former time-travelling Dr. David Tennant auditioned for the role of Lecter, which would have been interesting considering his chilling portrayal of Kilgrave from Jessica Jones. And although he didn't get the part, Bryan Fuller did want him to play a killer. Sadly, that never materialised. But anyway, the episode opens rather appropriately on a crime scene where Will Graham surveys the scene and then takes a moment. The pendulum is directly mentioned in the Red Dragon novel. In his mind, a silver pendulum swung in darkness to explain Will's process, and it's a nice touch that the pendulum is like a knife swinging through the air. We then get a first-hand view of Will Graham's thought process. As he doesn't watch the murders, he participates in them, as if he himself was the murderer. And this will be one of the main driving forces for him throughout the show, as he tiptoes between the mind of a detective and the mind of a killer. As we see Will committing the crimes, he describes the entire process. This was not a frenzied attack, but precise, methodical and sadistic. Will also discovers the killer tapped the phone and was able to override the security system. And if this incident seems familiar to you, then chances are you've read or seen Red Dragon. Because although it's missing a few details he would employ later, Bryan Fuller did confirm that this was one of the first killings of the Tooth Fairy. However, in retrospect, when the Tooth Fairy is introduced all the way in Series 3, this incident won't be mentioned again, which is a shame because it would have made a nice bookend to the show. We then shift to Will going over the case at the FBI Academy, and at the end of class, Jack Crawford, played by Lawrence Fishburne, approaches for a chat, and take notice of Will immediately putting on his glasses to talk to him. Will's glasses act like a barrier between him and whoever he's talking to. Will mentions he's on the autistic spectrum, and you can tell that by the way he has trouble keeping eye contact with Crawford. However, it should be mentioned as well that as the series goes on, Will's autism will be slowly phased out until it's not mentioned at all. Crawford asks Will to help on a profile to a particularly elusive killer of 8 girls. However, at this point, they're just abductions, because no bodies have shown up. Looking at all the victims, it's clear this killer has a type, and Will surmises that there's one true intended victim special to the killer. Crawford wants more of Will's insight, but Will is reluctant to share, even suggesting a Dr. Bloom, who we'll meet later. But Crawford convinces him to visit the last victim's home. Crawford talks to the parents while Will listens and even asks about the cat. I like to think, because this is a pilot, that that's a little reference to Red Dragon, because there is a moment when pets of victims are discussed. I could be thinking too much into it, but it's an interesting coincidence, especially when you consider the opening murder. They may be wanting to make the audience think that this is the Tooth Fairy again, and then try and surprise us with something new. With the cat not making a fuss, Will believes it was fed, and the girl was taken from the home, making the house a crime scene. And while one is established, Will is taken to see the girl's room, with them both being surprised to find the girl back in her bed. The case is getting a bit complicated. Will is given time alone to survey the scene, as once again the pendulum swings, and Will sees himself attacking the girl, but he's interrupted and broken from his concentration, which you can tell is quite traumatic for him. The interrupting detective, Beverly Katz, is far too sociable for Will to handle as well. Katz is also the first new character addition to this version of the story. And she won't be the last either, but it should be noted how well these new characters work within this universe. It's never jarring when a new character that's not in the books is introduced, which can be tricky to pull off, I find. Katz mentions that she found antler velvet in the girl's wounds. Two other investigators, Jimmy Price and Brian Zeller, give their 2 cents. And despite Price and Zeller being supporting characters not in the book, they will last a surprisingly long time. Fortunately, too, because they do add a more comedic and human element to all the death and metaphor. Zeller mentions that deer suffocate their prey with their antlers, which is exactly how the girl was killed. Will adds that the antler velvet may have been placed there by the killer to try and heal the girl, in a weird way, wanting to redeem himself and apologise for his actions. Well, one thing's for sure, the series is fully embracing the poetic and artistic murderer idea from the Harris novels. In the past, I've mentioned how I'm not much of a fan of that idea, but I've mellowed out somewhat since then, and I think this series is partly why. Will journeys home, and while driving he finds a stray dog who he spends time with bonding, eventually managing to bathe him and introduce him to his other dogs. So this is clearly not the first time he's done this. And that night while sleeping, Will gets the start of a revelation in a strange and twisted way, as he sees the victim levitate as if hanging on something. It shows how he's still working through the case in his mind and how it's not fully formed quite yet. And Will waking up in a bucket of sweat is the first indication that there's something wrong. Back at the FBI, Crawford is frustrated at the lack of progress, and Will washes his face, but his mind is always attacking him as the water fills with blood. And of course it doesn't help that the bathroom is near an exact recreation of the bathroom from The Shining. Brian Fuller explained that he always wanted to use that bathroom in one of his shows, but only in Hannibal did he have the budget to pull it off. And it is deliberately meant to evoke that Kubrick atmosphere to everything. And of course, the fact that the room almost looks like it's dipped in blood gives it a very creepy feeling and puts you on edge, which I'm sure Crawford can agree with.
Use the ladies' room!
Crawford is desperate to get Will on board and investigating the case, but it's clear he's so focused on catching the killer, he's not seeing the toll it's taking on Will, who's visibly shaking at the thought of continuing. This particular psychopath is new to Will because he cares, and in his mind is merciful to the people he's killing. There was something about this particular girl the killer couldn't honour, so he tried to fix. Interesting to note as well, the killer's love for his victims is something different and meaningful, transcending simple romance and sex. The series starting as it means to go on there, because that idea will keep cropping up throughout the show's run. Progress is being made elsewhere though, as Katz performs a swab test on the girl's clothes, finding a small metal shaving from a pipe threader, as we see what is implied to be the next victim visiting someone at a worksite. We will see this a lot throughout the show. It's nice that it takes the whole team's effort to catch the killer, and it's not just down to Will Graham's magical mind to save the day. Of course, that will get less prevalent as we go on though. Back at the FBI, we finally meet Alana Bloom, and she and Crawford discuss Will's mental well-being. Alana Bloom is actually a character from the book, however there, he was Alan Bloom and didn't really play much of a part. This version is far more expanded, which we will explore. Bloom is concerned for Will and thinks that Crawford isn't concerned enough, as she tells him to make sure Will doesn't get too close. Crawford promises, but there's some doubt there. The girl is being autopsied, and that's when Will's dream becomes clearer as he sees the girl mounted on antlers, and hearing that the girl's liver was removed and put back inside, he knows why she was placed back in her bed.
There's something wrong with the meat. She has liver cancer.
Giving us our first mention of cannibalism.
He's eating them.
As we cut to our first introduction to Hannibal Lecter, rather appropriately dining on foie gras, because we can't get away from references to liver with Lecter. So at least we know the show isn't going to be coy at all about Hannibal being a killer. It also nicely sets him up as a red herring for the episode. But the most important detail is that despite the show being called Hannibal, he appears at exactly the halfway mark, which tells me that the show may be about Hannibal, but he's not necessarily the main character. Later, Hannibal Lecter is mid-therapy session with a crying Dan Fogler as his patient, and this will be the first time we've seen Lecter as a practicing psychiatrist, so it's quite a notable moment. However, because it's Lecter, a simple thing like a snotty tissue being placed on a table becomes one of the most chilling moments in the entire series, because at this point, he's completely unrestrained and unpredictable, especially with this very Lecter-style phrase full of double meaning.
You have to convince yourself the lion is not in the room. When it is, I assure you, you will know.
Lecter sees his patient out and Crawford is there waiting for him. Lecter and Crawford talk, and there's no music for this scene. All we'll hear is the silence of the room and the dialogue. It's a great way to raise the tension because, like I said, we don't know what Lecter would do, and with no music, we hear everything. Especially this part about Lecter's secretary.
Followed her heart to the United Kingdom.
Did she though? Or was that another double meaning? Crawford notices one of Lecter's drawings. It's incredibly precise. However, the drawing isn't what's interesting, but the picture just beneath it. That picture is the Wound Man from Hans von Gersdorff's Feldbuch der Wundarznei. Apologies for my pronunciation there. And basically, it depicted all the medical maladies listed in the manuscript. It was also partly one of the reasons why Will Graham caught Lecter in the Red Dragon book, so its significance is not lost on me. And with Lecter saying that a scalpel cuts finer points on a pencil than a pencil sharpener, he appears to be going on the defensive.
I'm beginning to suspect you're investigating me, Agent Crawford.
That moment there is Lecter seconds from attempting to kill Crawford. And we know this because of an incident in Season 2, where the Wound Man appears again. But of course, all in good time. Unknown to Crawford, he manages to defuse the scene by mentioning that Lecter was recommended to him by Alana Bloom, and fortunately, Hannibal puts the scalpel down. Lecter is shown the map of the investigation, and we learn that the details of the murders have been leaked to the tabloids, published by one Freddie Lowndes, who you will remember was played by Philip Seymour Hoffman in the film to greasy perfection. That version of Freddie Lowndes was killed by the Tooth Fairy, so it's possible that this version is on borrowed time as well. Lecter and Will get chatting, almost bonding over their need for barriers and mental forts, and Lecter notices Will's lack of eye contact, and Will explains how eyes distract him with details, leading to this bit of poetry from Lecter.
Your values and decency are present, yet shocked at your associations. No forts in the bone arena of your skull for things you love.
Will's not stupid, though, and is insulted by the attempt at psychoanalyzing him.
Don't psychoanalyze me. You won't like me when I'm psychoanalyzed.
Will.
Is that a reference to Edward Norton? Because, you know, he played the Incredible Hulk. It's a bit random, but I wouldn't be surprised. Will storms out of the room, and Crawford suggests a less direct approach. Lecter explains that Will has pure empathy, the ability to understand and comprehend any point of view, regardless of how horrible that point of view may be. And Lecter also says he may be able to help Will see the killer. And out of context, there's nothing wrong with what Lecter said, but in context,
I think I can help Goodwill see his face.
It has a deeply disturbing tone and implication. And by absolute sheer coincidence, we then cut to a mutilated body displayed in a field. There's no connection there between those two events at all. Crawford says the news have caught wind of the murders, and this killer is being called the Minnesota Shrike, which takes the heat off Lecter a bit, because he was known as the Chesapeake Ripper. But despite all the fingers pointing elsewhere, Will can see that this murder wasn't committed by the same killer. This killer hated the victim, and with the mention of the woman missing her lungs, Hannibal cooks himself a meal of lungs and tenderloin. It's so liberating to see them not even bothering to be subtle. And it's now that Will sees the killer, and the girl we saw earlier is his golden ticket. Will isn't interested in this new sadistic copycat, but suggests Crawford ask Lecter to profile the killer, in the irony of ironies. Also, I need to highlight Mads Mikkelson's skill at conveying complex ideas with just facial expressions, because watching Lecter eat his victim is so interesting to watch. The joy of eating good food, the slight air of smugness about it, the superiority just oozes from every pore. And while showering back at his hotel, Will thinks about the most recent victim, imagining a feathered stag. The feathers represent the crows pecking at the body, the stag head. But it shows that Will is still thinking about the copycat. We're basically seeing how Will investigates and formulates theories in his own mind, albeit in a very metaphorical way. The next morning, Will is greeted at his door by Lecter offering breakfast, and again, out of context, Will complimenting the food would be perfectly normal, but with this soundtrack...
That's delicious, thank you.
And in context, it continues the deeply unsettling tone. It's clear Hannibal has a desire to befriend Will, but Will says he doesn't find him interesting enough.
You will.
I love how that sounds like a threat coming from Lecter, and he's not wrong. The conversation turns to the copycat killing and how it was gift-wrapped for Will, a negative image to allow him to see the picture of the killer he's after. Lecter makes Will laugh, telling him Crawford sees him as a fragile teacup. Will asks how Hannibal sees him.
The mongoose that went under the house when the snake slid by.
And we can see how this statement confuses Will. Again, it has a subtle double meaning. To Will, the snakes might be the killers he's trying to catch, but to Hannibal, the snakes might be something altogether different. Hannibal and Will have gone to the construction site we saw earlier and start going through their files, looking for someone who might fit Will's profile. One particular file stands out to Will in a pure instinctual moment: Garrett Jacob Hobbs. Outside, they're busy packing the files in the car, but Hannibal, clumsily, knocks some of the files over, leading to Will picking them up for him. However, while everyone is distracted, Lecter makes a phone call. Firstly, we see just how careful Hannibal is, using a tissue to prevent fingerprints, and also dialing with his knuckle. And this phone call is what I meant by Lecter being as if Lucifer on Earth. Lecter calls our killer, Garrett Jacob Hobbs, and issues a simple two-word warning.
They know.
Because Lecter's a tempter, a nudger of events. Lecter doesn't care about Hobbs, he just wants to see what happens and observe what Hobbs does when he's backed into a corner, and also see how Will reacts when he's given a snake to hunt. And we see the aftermath of Lecter's actions, with Will clearly in shock and covered in blood, as his pendulum swings once again, and we go back in time, with Will and Hannibal outside Hobbs's house. A woman runs out of the house having been slashed by Hobbs. Will tries to save her, but she dies quite quickly. Will draws his gun looking for Hobbs inside. But Lecter is cool, calm and collected as he silently surveys the scene. It's almost like he's not even there. Inside, Will finds Hobbs holding his daughter hostage and is given the opportunity to gun him down. And although it wasn't a full cut, Hobbs still managed to cut his daughter's throat quite significantly, as Will once again tries to help her, hearing Hobbs's final words to him, which is "see." This will get explored in later episodes. Lecter sees the situation, and despite being the casual observer this whole time, you can see in his face he recognizes Will's need to save the girl's life, and so he intervenes. But don't be fooled, Lecter never does anything selflessly. The girl is taken away in an ambulance, with Will left to process what happened. And back at the FBI, Crawford is looking for Will, but Bloom has taken over his teaching position, chastising Crawford for letting Will get too close, as the episode ends with Hannibal and Will at Hobbs's daughter Abigail's bedside. So that was episode 1 of Hannibal, and it was quite the opener, full of intrigue and powerful characters, and no one coming off as cartoony and ridiculous, which can't be said for some of the films sometimes. And this episode was the perfect aperitif for the series, because it had all the elements of what made the show so well loved. I'm looking forward to delving deep into each of these episodes, and I hope you enjoy them too. Thank you so much for watching. I'd like to give a massive thank you to all my Patreon donators. Their support really does help a lot. And if you would like to contribute to the channel and gain access to the Deusdaecon Reviews Discord server, the link is in the description below. And if you would like to get more content aside from the reviews, please consider checking out the Twitch channel where I stream live 5 days a week, 9 PM GMT, with subjects ranging from Let's Plays, discussions and movie watch-along nights. So join me live if you wish to see stunning moments of strategy just like this one. You, trade with me. Oh! That was a mistake! That was a mistake! Holy shit! What? Fuck! The link is in the description, so I'll hopefully see you there. And on YouTube, I'll see you next time.